Hi there. As you know, Gnosticism deals with the problem of evil by saying that the Creator God is evil and the world is evil. But of course, I think it should be recognized even by Gnostics today that the story of Genesis does provide a perfectly adequate explanation of how things have come to be so flawed. And to distinguish, I suppose, between imperfection and evil. Evil does imply intentionality, whereas imperfection implies implies sort of flawedness. It implies it's nobody's fault. It's just the way things are. Also, accident. Um, two cars, two drivers doing the wrong thing together create the possibility of an accident. But they don't intend to make a mistake. They just two drivers make a mistake at the same time, resulting in an accident, a car wreck. And so that's possibly what nature is, to a greater or less an extent. It's a car wreck, either waiting to happen or actually happening or has happened, and we're living with the consequences. But of course, Genesis, as I say, the key phrase in Genesis is that God saw that what he had created was good. And it's only the disobedience of Adam and Eve and their departure from the Garden of Eden, which in a way creates the possibility of imperfection to creep into our existence. Because before that, God created a perfect world. And so the Creator God did not intend to create an evil, flawed, imperfect world. And therefore, the God that created was not necessarily evil. It was the evil one that came into the Garden of Eden that turned Adam and Eve against the Lord. And so in Judaism, classical Judaism, it is quite obvious that it's not God's fault how it all turned out. Unless, of course, you're going to say that it's God's fault that there was an evil one that came into the Garden of Eden that turned Adam and Eve against God, which would sort of imply that God sort of turned against himself and created the possibility of his creation, Adam and Eve, turning against himself. So turning against what he'd done, turning against his authority. And but However way you look at it, modern Gnosticism has got to really obviously distinguish between imperfection and evil. Even if you think that the world has created evil, and the demiurge feeds off our fear, which is as a result of this imperfect evil world that has been created. Um, you know, that's not the sort of end of the story because we do have a choice. Does not matter, need not be is the formula I'm thinking of here. And if it need not be, then we definitely have the possibility of being in charge of our destinies and making the best of all possible worlds. And creating, spiritualizing matter, for example, which is an issue I cover later on, and also meeting the challenges of scarcity and accident and threat, etc., and rising to the occasion, and being decent people despite the imperfections of the world. So it's not like we are sort of automata that are just going to be evil because of there's an evil world. We have a choice and we have free will. We have reason. We can divide out the loaves and fishes such that scarcity is not a great problem. because it isn't really scarcity that is the problem, it's the distribution of food and resources that is the problem. And through reason and application of reason, humankind can deal with scarcity as it can with accident and threat. So there's the possibility of kindness and compassion being cultivated and altruism being cultivated, and so it does not matter. The matter is evil and therefore has no value, but it doesn't have to be like that. So there's a possibility that you drive evil into the background of this paradigm, and you put imperfection into the foreground of this paradigm, and that really sort of kind of refers the modern Gnostic back to the Genesis story, that perhaps it isn't the Creator God's fault, and the fault lies in the disobedience of Adam and Eve. But that, of course, is a judgment paradigm based on the judgment of Adam and Eve, which Marcion, for example, but he wasn't a Gnostic. He wouldn't like this idea that Adam and Eve could be judged and were judged and thrown out of the Garden of Eden. They weren't given a second chance. That was it. They disobeyed, and that's it. They ate of the forbidden fruit, and that's it. And then imperfection arises after that, and avarice and competition, and obviously the murder, the great murder, the first murder ever committed by Cain, and this is it's an interesting thing, because obviously, resulting from the idea that we've got to make the best of things, you have positive atheism on one hand and positive religion on the other. And that obviously brings us back to the idea that, that the demiurge is not necessarily evil in that sense, because the fault is not with the Creator God, but perhaps with the demiurge that spoilt creation. Perhaps you could say that, and that wouldn't be too far off the mark either. To say that some god or deity spoilt perfection and introduced humankind to disobedience, which is an imperfection. And I think that modern Gnosticism has to at least reconcile the fact that it's possible to have an evil demiurge on one hand and a good creator God on the other, and that's going to be something of a bit of quite a reconciliation to make if you're going to be very, very purist about your Gnosticism, and you get sort of embroiled, I suppose, in a philosophical debate between of definitions between of imperfection and evil, and definitions of a God that could give rise to evil on one hand, and a God that allows imperfection to arise, but doesn't take the blame for it, because the blame is squarely with Adam and Eve. They are the cause of imperfection. They are the cause of the problems because of their disobedience. So it's an interesting and so rather, I think the modern Gnostic is sometimes finds himself or herself in some confusion over this issue, which perhaps you just don't get in Genesis, and that I think the story of Genesis is more consistent, really, despite the fact that philosophically the problem of evil still arises in that a good God allows the evil one to tempt Adam and Eve away from God, and away from the Garden of Eden, and the Garden of Eden sort of collapses and they leave it. Um, so there's a philosophical aspect, which, of course, obviously Jews and Muslims and Christians really don't bother with. And this world becomes a test of faith and a test of morality, and a test of endurance, and a test of acceptance as well of the will of God. And of course, then we get into the book of Job and all the philosophical details arising from the book of Job as well. And of course, all these stories, are in the Judaic canon, and they are there to explain why things are as they are. But in my that's why, in a way, I don't put too much credence, in fact, on the creation myths of Gnosticism. Really, um, in my paradigm, the paradigm that I've been contemplating, it's like two parallel universes. And and one is the demiurge's universe, and the other is the universe of the transcendental God. And basically, there is no connection between them unless the Holy Spirit makes an appearance or becomes manifest, or the angels or Jesus Christ. They represent a kind of a rung, if you like, between these two shafts, if you look like a ladder. And the two parallel lines never meet, but a line that can join these two parallel lines on a temporary basis and by degrees. And of course, so the paradigm, I don't really, perhaps this idea of the creator God being evil, in a way, doesn't have to arise if you have this sort of parallel universe paradigm, because it really doesn't matter if the demiurge was originally good, or originally evil, or the demiurge was perfect, and imperfection arose within that perfection. Or that's for this demiurge track, as for the line underneath. And the transcendental is just infinite anyway. And then, of course, this Hindu idea of Maya or illusion enters into the picture or the formula. So the line here is just illusion, and reality is the line above it. And then you get various avatars and messengers, sort of traveling in between these two dimensions, as it were. And the soul itself travels between the two dimensions, which is an issue I've already covered in other videos. So the question is the world imperfect or evil? Or is it imperfect on which evil entities feed? Or is it an evil world which enslaves the good in its embrace? And I think all these ideas, you see, they sort of flow between each other. And I think there's a kind of, it's hard to pick away at it intellectually, in a way. And what seems like a great slogan, the soul is enslaved in matter, you can look at it and it sort of breaks down in the face of other explanations. Um, so it's almost like that, there shouldn't be a confusion or a conflict of explanations here, really. Maybe it's just best to leave all explanations alone and simply say that the worlds of the demiurge, of this creator God, are sort of on one track, as it were, and the worlds of the transcendental God are on another track. And really, we don't have to worry too much about the origins of either. Certainly, and that's or even the end of either, really, because we are not going to be part of this particular set of demiurge dimensions for very long. So in a way, it doesn't really matter how it all arose. It just is as it is. And then we can, we have to deal with it as it is. And we find ourselves in this in this world, in this dimension, on this track. And we are then faced with crisis, which means choice, of either going into fear, which is the food fodder, so called the food of the demiurge and his agents, or we make the best of this world, and we make right choices, and we make compassionate, kind choices, and this is perhaps the lesson, if there is a lesson, to be learnt from our relationship with this particular realm of the demiurge. So I think that as a modern Gnostic, I think you have to sort of be quite eclectic, and you can't really afford to be too dogmatic about about evil and imperfection. I think the two concepts run together. A bit like sand running together. I think colors, watercolors running together. I mean, I think you try to keep them separate, but there is going to be a little bit of color bleeding between the two concepts. And often modern Gnostics are going to either go with one or all of the creation myths of Gnosticism, classical Gnosticism, or they may simply go back to the original Genesis story, and look at that, as many Christians do, and be satisfied with that as an explanation of why things are as they are today. And of course, it should be understood that classical Orthodox Christianity is about time. It's about things that happen on a timeline, such as obviously the fall, the flood, the ministry of Jesus Christ and redemption, the work done on the cross, which is all about time and God intervening along this timeline, and various things happen on the timeline, and it's about man's original disobedience to God and man's continuing disobedience to God, and God's intervening in various different ways along this timeline until the final intervention at the end of time. But of course, this all originates from a God judging Adam and Eve in the first place, and not giving them a second chance or not forgiving them. And I think it's this judgment of Adam and Eve, which Marcion, for example, dislikes, and he denies the judgment. And if that judgment is denied, then God is not really dealing with the disobedience of humankind at all, because that assumption falls, and then the whole of Orthodox Christianity sort of comes into question, if you follow Marcion's logic and if you follow Gnostic logic. But a lot of modern Gnostics, they don't really know where they might stand on this debate. And in any case, does it really matter? Is it a debate worth, fighting over, or arguing over, or certainly persecuting each other over? And at the end of the day, I suppose there's an ecumenical movement between all facets of Christianity, Islam and Judaism, and progressive elements of these religions anyway. and there's an ecumenical movement towards basically looking not so much at the explanations, but what we're actually going to do about our existential problems as they arise, and as they actually affect us now. So that, I guess, is reducing religion to a moral paradigm, because it's really, the question is how we're going to deal with the world as it is, not how the world as we would wish it to be, or the world as it might be after the end times, after the rapture and all that. So, it's like you're looking at the here and now. It's how you deal with the world as it is, and that possibly is where the modern Gnostic is actually sort of positioned, as it were, in terms of what they believe. And so humanism arises, obviously, from Gnosticism and Orthodox Christianity, and there's less emphasis on theology and more on moral living, I suppose, moral paradigms, which we see in the modern Christian church and the modern Gnostic church. We see an emphasis on moral dilemmas and dealing with moral dilemmas and having a moral paradigm and having moral compass, rather than dealing with intricacies of theology.